Good Shepherd. Talked about the shepherd. Jesse had his communion meditation, which was good, about the shepherd. We used the 23rd Psalm, which was part of that. If you go back a little bit before this passage in John 10, you see that Jesus is dealing with a conflict with the scribes and Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers of the law, and dealing with the relationship between Jesus and these individuals, and really the comparison between the teaching and the method of teaching that Jesus has used as compared to the method of teaching that the scribes and Pharisees used. It's interesting that, probably a half a dozen places or so in the Scriptures, there's a verse similar to the one that is in Matthew, the 7th chapter, the 28th and 29th verse, which is at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. In this passage of Scripture it says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one having authority, and not as the teachers of the law. And like I said, you could go through and find a half a dozen or so places in the Scripture where the writers of the Gospel make this comparison between the teaching of Jesus and the teachings of these Jewish leaders. A little bit of an explanation on this and thinking about examples of what we're talking about. The scribes and Pharisees in their teachings had the goal of basically showing how smart they were, of showing how much power they could gain through their teaching, to show that they were smart rather than worrying about whether or not the student got a knowledge of the truth. And interestingly enough, in their teaching, they felt like it was important that the student followed the rules and regulations, but it wasn't necessarily important that they followed all the rules and regulations. So it's sort of an interesting situation you have here. By comparison, Jesus was what many people call the master teacher. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, you look at this passage in John 9 and 10, you see that Jesus was the best of the best when it came to teaching. And his concern was not for his own glory, but that the student understood what he was saying and why it was important. In the midst of this, Jesus tells a story of the Good Shepherd. Now, note that this really isn't a parable. A parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And we have many parables. I'm going to be talking about a parable next week. But this is an earthly story with a spiritual idea. He's just taking an example of something that the people knew. They knew all about shepherds. And so he's talking about a shepherd and making a spiritual application in this situation. To begin with, Jesus talks about the shepherd and the thief. First 6 verses of John 10. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, the man who does not enter the sheep's pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. Now this isn't complicated. We can understand that real easily. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, the shepherd, and the sheep listen to his voice. He hears his own sheep by name, or he calls his own sheep by name, and leads them out. The shepherd goes in and leads the flock out. When he has brought all out of his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follows him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize the stranger's voice. Jesus is drawing a comparison between the shepherd and the individual who's trying to steal the sheep. He's drawing a comparison here. And you know, the next part that came to my mind when I was working on this is thinking about what I call modern religious thieves, or biblical thieves in this context. And think about individuals that are trying to steal the sheep. They're trying to draw people away from the church and the following of Christ and the will of God. The first group that I think about this is is the liberal thief. The individual who is following after the liberal teachings, not political liberalism now. Not talking about politics, but liberal theologians who come along and deny the inspiration of the Scriptures, who deny the divinity of Jesus, who want to make Christianity some kind of just basic philosophy that we follow, and we can follow any other philosophy that doesn't make any difference. A liberal teacher who is trying to steal the sheep of Jesus. The second type of thief that I thought about was the evangelist. I picked on Robert Tillman primarily because somebody brought him up in conversation the other day, and he just came to mind. But we can think of all kinds of individuals who are in it simply to make money. Evangelists who are trying to blow themselves up, get rich. And there are a huge number of those who are out there in our culture today whose only objective is trying to line their own pockets and lead people away from Christ. And I narrowed it down to the local congregation. There are preachers in churches that are simply doing the same thing that the scribes and Pharisees were doing. They're trying to blow themselves up. They're trying to make themselves important. They're trying to build up their own reputation in the community. They're trying to get a large number of people to follow them because that makes them important. And they're not worried about whether or not they're leading the flock in the way that Christ wants them to go. They're not worried about making sure that they have the Word of God and the people have the Word of God. People who are leading somebody away from Christ. Then the next one is what I call churches claiming a new message. Now, there are a variety of those out in the Sunday school class that I've been teaching the last couple of weeks. We've gone to Galatians, the 1st chapter and the 8th verse, where Paul says, if anybody teaches a message other than the one that I'm teaching, let him be accursed or let him be condemned. In other words, trying to lead people away. The most current event in this situation is seen in this little picture I have up here, where it says Judgment Day is coming on May the 21st at 6 p.m. local time. I don't know whether it's local everywhere or local in New York where this guy started out with this idea. But saying the end of the world is going to come. And there are people that are flocking to him, saying, yeah, that's it, he's got the message. And yet the Scripture says nobody knows. But he says, I know. Leading people away from Christ. Now, the scary thing about this is that the liberal teacher that I spoke of first will use this as a means to attack the church. And some church members who buy into this will be the ones who are drawn away from Christ. And then last of all, there are people who claim that all religions are the same. I don't know how many of you watched Walker, Texas Ranger. You might guilty of that way back when. Every now and then, he went out in the country to see his Indian friend and had this spiritual awakening with the great spirit of the Native Americans. Last night we were watching TV and I got up and said, sure, I got to put something in my sermon. And there was a picture of the Middles. Because last night, if any of y'all saw that episode that was on TV, they were talking about the spiritualist who was talking to the dead and had a message from this individual for their father, and had a message from this individual's mother about this, and somebody just died and said, they're all right, I talked to them and they're just fine. The only place in the Scripture where somebody talks to the dead is in the book of Samuel. Saul, the king of Israel, God's Spirit had left him.